Chapter 32. Sin Yan Seol. Finbar sat at the MG board. He wished he had accepted the invitation to search the canal, but being ordered to do anything by a so-called superior chafed at him. He was no fucking Kern, bowing and scraping to any bloody jack serving the crown. A fucking Canadian lieutenant could shove his demands and guidance up his arsehole. He looked at the broken Belgian sergeant seated against the wall. He did not know precisely what the man had gone through, but it shattered his spirit, and how, the poor slob. Caitlin was beside him. He watched her nurse the man. What the fuck had become of the hard girl he knew in Kildare? Her fire had been doused. Shame. There was a time when he thought he loved her. That time was long gone now. He would miss the fucks. As dull as they had become recently, the memory of when things were good still lingered. Best not to think of it. It would only confuse the issue if the time came when it would be smarter to head off on his lonesome. Sin Yan Seol, he muttered. Caitlin glanced up at the familiar Gaelic expression, "Such is the life you have." "What?" she asked. Finn shook his head and smiled. He looked back to the mule path approach beyond the MG nest. "Nothing, girl. Nothing at all." Caitlin sighed. How this bastard had come back into her life, she had no idea. He brought her entire past back with him. It had only been 3.5 days since the barn, but she thought she shut the chapter on him when she cast the pistols and grenades he risked life and limb for into the open grave. Burying her past apparently did not take into account the past desire to dig itself out and stick it to her. Kildare. A year passed. Finbar was the one who handed her the pistol with a smile and told her to go to confession on Saturday evening. She had, kneeling in the confessional, telling all her wrongs from the past week, but spilling none of the sins she intended to commit for her Irish sisters and brothers come Monday morning. She figured if she survived the assassination, she could beg God's forgiveness for those on Sunday next. After 2 sleepless nights, when Easter Monday morning came, she did her duty for an Ireland free of British scum rule. She closed her eyes when she pulled the trigger, but somehow she could still see it all. "Oh, fucking hell!" she heard Finn bark out. She looked over and saw him sweep the barrel across and grab the trigger. "Oh, bloody fucking hell!" he repeated. It took Jonah, Wolfgang, Halstead, Rupert, Adolf, and Donny half an hour to work their way through the Reekval barbed wire scrambles. The snow started falling thick when they were a quarter of the way through. When they came out the other side, dusted with snow, each had more than a few fresh nicks and cuts. Wolfgang led, helping Halstead along, quickening the pace as he felt evening coming on. Even though he could not see sun through the fast-moving clouds, he could sense its pending absence hanging over them, an alpine avalanche about to roar down from the heights and consume them. Aiding the wounded Aussie gave him some purpose and kept his mind from wandering back to Sebastian's last days. His mind found a needed dose of clarity with the respite from those images. Each time they tried to reappear, he shut them away by focusing on supporting Halstead and hurrying him along the best he could. For his own part, Halstead was numb to it all. He had accepted death, and it had not come. He had tasted punishment for his sins, and somehow survived it. For now, the wound from the spear might get him yet. That type of long, painful death scared him. He'd watched a lot of boys die that way and did not wish it for himself. A bullet wound alone was a bad thing, but in the trenches each wound brought invisible death along with it. Imagine a boy sitting in the trenches. The bottom of the trench is an inch or more of befouled water, polluted by mustard gas, urine, and the mouldering year-old dead bodies buried in the trench walls, their remains steadily weeping juices through the earth into the trench ecosystem. The boy is already bleeding, hands cut on barbed wire. They sent him out to secure that morning before the dawn defense. While he was at it, he and his mate Heinrich pulled the dead body of their pal Jakob back with them. Jakob had been rotting into a wet mess in no man's land for a week after a sniper caught him in the open and knocked his brains out from 500 yards away. Poor Jakob literally came apart at the seams as they pulled the stinking wreck back to their trench. He got all over both of them. Now the attack is coming. The boy loads his rifle with his bleeding fingers, which, for good measure, were already spattered with microscopic fecal matter from a dysentery mess that sprayed out of him into the commode trench the night before. Now those remnants are stewed up with Jacob's rot and freshly seasoned with the poisons from the foul trench water. The boy loads his bullets into his magazine with those same hands, and as the assault comes, he fires one at the enemy. His aim is poor, so he only nicks the man coming for him, but is enough to stop that man's charge in its tracks. Bleeding and in pain, he turns for home, certain the Germans just gifted him a wound good enough to deliver him to the comfort of an aid station without getting branded a coward. Perhaps it will be enough to take him back to England to see his wife and daughter for at least a brief reprieve. He is grateful it is not a severe injury. He sits and waits patiently while the horribly hurt are shepherded through the triage station or left on stretchers to die. Finally, a kind, tired VAD nurse brings him in. She ministers to his injury, cleaning it out and binding it up. Then she sends him on his way with a cigarette and a mug of lukewarm tea, which he accepts with a smile. He goes to sleep that night, dreaming of the ferry ride back to Dover for convalescence. Perhaps the war will end before they force him to return. He does not know that he is already dead. 48 hours later, consumed by fever and pain, that is when he realizes the end has come. Then he is gone. Killed not by the bullet, but by all the invisible things the bullet carried with it when it found him. Dr. Halstead sighed. He knew it was probably only his imagination, but his wound did not feel right. He wondered if the burn was the beginning of infection. Halstead wondered where the spear that caught him had been, what gifts it brought with it when it struck, and what invisible murderers it might have left behind when it violently exited. He shuddered at the thought. If it went rotten and gangrenous, he would find a way to finish the job himself before the fevers came, and that would be absolutely fine with him. It would have to be. Jonah Unger was walking just behind Wolfgang and Halstead. He wished that James was with them, nattering away incomprehensibly. At least the sound of James Cox's voice had kept him from thinking about the state of current events. Adolf walked just behind Jonah, hand resting on Jonah's shoulder, the dirty gauze over his eyes still sealing them tight. Being blind, following his fellows through the barbed wire, was a terrible experience. He had fallen, through no fault of Jonah's, and cut his hands badly on the metal thorns. Jonah had removed his puttees and wrapped them around Adolf's hands to protect the wounds and prevent injury should he take another spill. It had been a kind act, And if Adolf's eyes were not wrapped in cotton, tears of gratitude would have flowed down his cheeks. As it was, he mustered a quiet thank you. Donnie clambered through the wire after them all, limping along. Adolf's fall was his fault, in part. They all agreed that Donnie would do his best to assist the blind boy from behind. But Donnie's mind wandered, as it tended to. He was thinking about Missy, wondering if she missed him. He certainly hoped that was the case. Then he wondered if she was making sex with somebody else in town, like Sheriff Coombs or one of his big strapping deputies. He felt a flush of rage and shame at the thought of being cuckolded by one of those fellows while he was over here risking his life for the nation. Then he remembered that the world had fallen apart, and none of it really mattered anyway. Then he watched Adolf's foot catch on a metal stake, and before he could think to grab him or cry out a warning, the Austrian boy was crashing down behind Jonah, reaching out to save himself, catching hold of barbed wire, and slicing up his hands badly. "Oh, gosh, I'm sorry, buddy," said Donnie, while Jonah wrapped Adolf's hands. He heard the Austrian mutter something that sounded like donkey to Jonah. Donnie laughed in what seemed to him like a pure non sequitur. Adolf glanced towards Donnie's laugh and realized it was the first time since Good Friday that he could see something. Beneath the gauzy screen of his bandages, he saw shades of black, white, and grey. His vision was returning. He felt a quiet burst of joy. Perhaps he would be all right after all. He considered tearing off the bandages, but then he thought better of it. Being blind Adolf brought him considerably more sympathy than being sighted Adolf ever had. He was not quite ready to give that up. Jonah helped him to standing and led him onward through the wire. Donnie kept his focus from then on, supporting Adolf from the rear. 15 minutes later, they were out in the open. After they broke free from the nest of wire and climbed past the zigging and zagging lines of trenches, they found the precipice overlooking Napoleon's denuded canyon. They took the steep descent to the San Quentin Canal banks with care. It was a slippery affair, as the mud and wet snow combined to make it treacherous going. Halstead nearly dragged Wolfgang down on a tumble, but Jonah grabbed him by the belt and saved them before the pair could slip away. At the bottom, seeing no other way across, they walked north to the ersatz bridge of black barges. Crossing the snowy decks on tired legs was a feat. When they were all safely across, they paused to catch their breath. "Where should we go, Captain?" asked Rupert. Wolfgang looked at the steep, snowy climb to the canal's eastern ridge. It was not an inviting journey. He imagined the British, Australians, and French trying to climb it under machine gun fire. Napoleon would never have imagined his canal serving this purpose, but the blood-lustful conqueror in him would have approved. The other option was the tunnel mouth to the north, yawning up before them. Neither choice held any appeal whatsoever. With the snow pushing west, covering the sun, there was only a false daylight cast down by the clouds, so Wolfgang had no true bearing on how close the sun's actual setting was. A climb up the steep canyon wall, through more barbed wire and over 8-foot deep fire trenches seemed a fool's errand. The tunnel. Come. Rupert did not tell Wolfgang that the idea of going into a dark tunnel scared him breathless. Honesty on that front did not appear to have any real purpose at present. Wolfgang put his neck under Halstead's arm and wrapped his own around Halstead's back. Then he helped him up, walking him toward the tunnel's mouth. Rupert, Jonah, Adolf, and Donnie hustled along the mule path after them. Finbar had been reflecting on images from prior to his escape across the Somme River when the figures appeared, backlit by the evening's light. Oh, fucking hell. Oh, bloody fucking hell. He gripped the handles tightly and scanned the sights until the pair of figures limping along at the front were walking straight into the line of fire. Caitlin yelled, "Don't!" Finbar squeezed the trigger. There was a sharp bam bam. Then the bastard MG jammed up tight and seized. Finn pulled the trigger again, but nothing happened. "Fucking hell!" he yelped, fumbling with the cloth belt, trying to find the cause. He grabbed the crank handle and pulled it back hard. The belt advanced, but did not eject the cartridges that were in the gun's mouth. He pulled it again, and still no joy. He glanced toward the tunnel mouth and saw that the Germans were in disarray. The front two were down. The third and fourth in the line were grabbing one and trying to drag him back to safety. The last man in the line had bolted, disappearing out of view, while the second to last was just standing there, stock still, a sitting duck. Finn hit the latch mechanism and the machine gun top popped open. He grabbed at the belt and pulled, but one cartridge that had misfired was jammed against the ejection hole. He yanked it hard, trying to pry it free. It exploded. Bam! Finn's eyes snapped closed. The entire world shrunk into the confines of his body. He felt hot blood spatter his face. His ears rang. He felt himself gasp, then opened his eyes. His left middle finger was dangling from a thread of skin. His ring finger was gone. He shrieked in shock and pain and grabbed his wrist, not wanting to touch his deformed hand. Renoir heard Caitlin's cry of, "Don't!" When the first two bullets flew out of the MG, a burst of adrenaline shocked him out of his fog. The habit of war launched him out of thought into action. He grabbed a fresh Mauser from the wall rack and chambered around as he knelt by the murder hole next to the jammed MG. He saw the men at the tunnel mouth and sighted on them. Just as he was about to fire at the man in field grey at the front of the column, Caitlin cried out again, "Alexander, stop!" His finger leapt off the trigger as he recognized Jonah Unger. Renoir turned toward Finn, who was frantically trying to right the MG, and yelled, "Wait!" just as the jammed round exploded in the chamber and sent fingers flying. It was a second shock to Renoir's system. The air rang. He felt Caitlin rush past him to Finn's aid. She took hold of him, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. Finn, a wounded animal, tried to fight back against her, but he went feeble. He slipped down to the floor, howling out in pain. Renoir dropped the Mauser and ran for the door. He flipped the beam out of its brackets and threw the door open, then sprinted toward Wolfgang and Halstead, who were lying on the towpath, with Jonah and Rupert just behind them. Halstead was collapsed on the mule tracks. It was a bloody mess, but it was not fresh. His wounds were all dry, dark brown. Wolfgang was on the tracks beside him. The blood on his face was bright red, wet, and pouring out. Wolfgang had not felt a thing. None of them heard the bam bam as the MG's first bullets fired. The first round zipped between Wolfgang and Halstead's heads, so close that the heat and scent of the hot lead registered in their senses. The second round was nearly concurrent. It struck Wolfgang's face, cutting and burning along his cheek to the bone. Then it sliced like a dull blade, riding the edge of his skull, tearing off the bottom third of his right ear and spinning away, burying itself in the stone wall beyond. Wolfgang lost hold of Halstead and fell back, hitting hard. Wind knocked clean out of him, stunned. Then Rupert and Jonah were there, grabbing him, trying to pull him to safety. There was another distant bam. When he looked down toward his feet, the man who killed his brother was kneeling over him. A look of concern on his face. Renoir was saying something, but Wolfgang's shocked brain was not yet capable of hearing words. Then Jonah was with him, and the pair were helping him up, each under an arm, pulling him deeper into the darkened tunnel. Durant, James, and Francois heard Finn's machine gun rounds echo through the canal. They left the barge behind them in the lock, running the entire way to the MG nest with just the bouncing light from the flashlights to guide them. They heard the distant sound of Caitlin yelling, "Wait!" then the bam, as Finn blew his fingers off and shrieked. When they reached the nest, Renoir and Jonah were pulling the injured Wolfgang through the whiteness of the door's portal. Renoir and Jonah helped Wolfgang to the cement floor. Dr. Halstead, he is out there, injured too. Francois, Durant, and James continued on out the door. They found Halstead on the path, sitting up, slumped over with Rupert beside him. Behind them stood a German corporal with bandaged eyes and hands. He had stepped outside of the tracks and was standing 6 inches from the side of the canal and the cold green water below. James saw how close the blind boy was to stepping over the edge and cried out, "Stop, fella, stop there!" Adolf heard him. Stop had universal meaning. He did as he was told. He raised his hands in surrender. James approached slowly. "It's okay, fella, it's okay, just don't take no more steps, or you'll end up in the drink for certain." James reached him and took his arm. Adolf recoiled, but James stayed calm and held him. "Hold on, easy now." He gently guided Adolf back from the brink and inside the perimeter of the mule tracks. "Golly, you had me worried we was going to have to go in there and fish you out." Adolf did not understand a lick of what James said, but he nodded. "You can put your arms down. You don't got to surrender to me. War's over, in case you hadn't heard." James saw movement at the tunnel mouth beyond them. When he realized who it was, his jaw dropped. He did not believe it for a minute. "Donnie? Holy God, Donnie! Donnie, you're alive! Praise Jesus, you're alive!" Isaiah heard the sounds of MG fire. "Fuck," he said. Shotgun in one hand, lantern in the other, he ran toward the fight. The Mastiff quickly outpaced him, disappearing into the darkness. Isaiah squeezed past the electric mule by the first lock and ran on. When he got about 100 yards from the MG nest, he slowed a bit. There was still commotion ahead of him, but it all seemed like aftermath, not action. The Mastiff was barking at Durant, who led Dr. Halstead through the door and into the cavern. Isaiah jogged the rest of the way. When he arrived, it was a sight to see. Finbar had stopped shrieking. His bloody left hand was wrapped tightly. He was holding his wrist with his right hand and staring at the mangled appendage with a sulking rage. Caitlin had moved to Wolfgang and was trying to stop the blood flow from his head wound. "Alexander, don't let him fall asleep," she said. "Oui," the Belgian replied. "Stay with me, Wolfgang. Look at me. You must stay with me." As they set the shotgun and lantern down and knelt next to Renoir and Wolfgang. Wolfgang's look was woozy. His eyes clearly wanted to roll back in his head as he worked to focus them on Renoir. Renoir slapped his uninjured left cheek gently. "You must stay with me, mon ami. Stay here with me." "The hell happened here?" Isaiah asked Durant. Durant just shook his head. Isaiah looked up as James led a blind German corporal through the door. "Jesus, the whole damn bunch of us back together." When Isaiah saw who was behind James, his body went white hot, and he saw nothing else.